today is sponsored for Refuah Shlema for Chaim Tzvi Ben Yanta Bluma. So have him in mind as we learn today. We're up to number 30 in the Sefer Chinuch's counting. Remember, we're doing the 10 Commandments, or really the 10 statements. The first two actually include more than two. They include closer to about 5 separate, unique mitzvot of belief in God, and secondly, not to have any other gods before God. You'll also remember, perhaps from the first class, we said how the 10 Commandments are divided between thought, and then speech, and then action, and then back to speech, and then back to thought, right? The first thought, belief in God, not to have any other gods. Then we get the speech, which is today's commandment of not to take God's name in vain. Then we get into action of Shabbat and honoring parents and do not kill, do not murder, do not commit adultery, those. And then again back to speech about giving false testimony. And then finally back to thought of not to covet. So we're in this speech section of the 10 Commandments. And the way it's translated in this book is, you shall not take the Lord's name in vain. The Hebrew, which we'll return to at the end of the Shir, is lo tisat shem Hashem elokecha l'shav. Do not lift God's name for vanity, for purposeless reasons. This is a difficult mitzvah to understand, not so much the mitzvah itself, but its placement in the 10 Commandments. Do not swear vainly in God's name. Doesn't necessarily seem to be, it's an important idea, but that it's one of the 10 Commandments seems perhaps a little bit out of place. I just printed out very quickly before I came here some cartoons of people making fun actually of that particular understanding of one of the 10 Commandments. People are in traffic, and at a church it actually says, in their billboard says, keep using my name in vain and I'll make rush hour much longer. If you must curse, that's also often understood, that this commandment is also understood in the non-Jewish world as not swearing in God's name, but not cursing in God's name. It's a poor translation. When we talk about swearing, we talk about an oath, right? Mishpah. But when it's translated, the English, swearing sounds like cursing. So there's a billboard, if you must curse, use your own name, as if the problem is using bad language with God's name. This one comedian has a very long piece about it where he says, it's such a borderline thing. You're going to, on June, he's talking about how you're going to be sent to hell forever if you simply say God's name with a bad attitude. If you say with a good attitude, you're okay. It's very borderline. He doesn't really understand why this is one of the 10 Commandments either. And it's a good question. Forget about the cursing. Swearing in God's name is so terrible about that idea. Or even if we want to say that it's bad, is it really, deserve to be really the third of the 10 Commandments in that regard? You can add to the question a little bit, because the rabbis understand it more severe than any of the 10 Commandments. If you look at source number 4, this is a midrash that we'll return to in just a little bit, but on this verse it says lo tisa, right? Don't raise God's name for vanity purposes. Lo yinakeh, and it is followed by the phrase that God will not acquit, God will not forgive. There's only 2 commandments of the 10 Commandments that include this phrase, lo yinakeh. In other words, you're involved in murder, you're involved in adultery. There's an opportunity that God will ultimately forgive you for that sin. Even if there's punishment involved, you could be forgiven. But this one, lo yinakeh, once you engage in this, it's almost impossible to rectify the situation. So the question that I'm going to look at is, what's really taking place here? Because it obviously can't be simply to swear in God's name or to take God's name and not really, mean it. There has to be something more significant, and that's what we're going to try to look at in the Sefer Chinuch and elsewhere. The Sefer Chinuch, by the way, I only could put a little bit of him on the page. It's one of his longest ones. It goes on for quite some time, and he explains all the differences between this mitzvah and where oaths appear later on in the Torah and the Nedarim appear later on in the Torah. There's another commandment that says specifically, do not swear in God's name l'shaker, falsely. So what's the difference between this one of l'shav, for purposeless, I guess is the best translation, versus falsely? That's a separate command. And he gives us a few different answers. Some of them are certainly very relevant to think about. He talks about when you speak falsely, which, by the way, this is not 100% accurate with what this mitzvah says. This says l'shav, not falsely. But he says, when you speak falsely, you are not just, it's not just a problem of lying. And of course, the punishment for being a liar is you're ultimately not believed when you're telling the truth. But it's more than that, is that you seem to suggest that there's no such thing as truth. I mean, if you could just use your words for whatever you want to say without any rooted in a reality or truth, so then what are you saying about the absolute truths in life? What do you say about one morality, one God? If you don't treat truth seriously on a small level, then you will also have problems treating it seriously on a bigger level. The second issue he raises, why perhaps it's very important, is just to think about the importance of words. One of the things he notes, for example, with Nedarim, is that we have the ability of changing something with our words, right? This is permissible to me now, and if I were to make a neder, I could, through the power of words, say that this is prohibited to me now. So I've changed the nature of this item. I've actually, first of all, I could have made it more holy, right? Because you can make things holy for hekdesh, for the purposes of the temple. You can also make things prohibited to you. Words have an incredible power. And one of the things the Sefer Chinuch seems to be suggesting is we forget the power of words. And so what we're doing here is we're saying, when you use your words, make sure you appreciate how significant they really are. Yeah.
Well, I'll give you two examples, and they're very common. One is people say, "Oh my gosh."
Yes.
But they don't say "gosh," they say "God."
Right.
Another one is my previous husband, when he saw 9/11 television or whatever, what he said, "Holy cow."
Yeah. Of course, right. So people want to make, and by the way, there's something to that. There's a respect by not using God's name in that regard. But is that really?
Does that count?
Is that really what the Sefer Chinuch is saying is one of the 10 Commandments? Not to say God, and by the way, it's an interesting question of whether or not taking God's English name is the same as taking God's Hebrew name. It's a machloket. Most actually say it's only when you use God's Hebrew name, although there are some who in the Talmud speak about using God's Aramaic name is a problem, and so therefore maybe English is also a problem. But is that really what he's saying? That's really my question, because even if you say that it's a concern not to engage in, does it really deserve this place here, plus the addition of lo yinaket, that God will forgive you for this? So, as I said, the Sefer Chinuch says it's important to realize how powerful words can be. There's a wonderful story I once heard from a Chabad friend of mine about a shochet who was in South Africa. And the story goes something to this effect, that everyone goes into the slaughterhouse on Friday, they do their work, they're leaving, for the weekend, and the non-Jewish guard who's guarding the place says, wait a second, there's still someone still inside, you can't lock up the place and go home for the weekend. And the people who are in charge of the plant look around and they count everyone, and they say, no, we have everyone here, it's fine, we're locking up, we're leaving for the weekend. And the guard says, no, I'm sorry, I'm not going to let you leave, I'm going to physically hold on to you until you go and check. I know for sure someone's still inside. They can't understand what happened, but they're going to humor this guy. They walk into the slaughterhouse, they check everything, and they actually go into the large freezer. And when they open the freezer, they see actually one of the Hasidim is lying on the floor. Apparently he was moving something and he bumped his head and he collapsed inside the freezer. They take him out, they bring him to the hospital, and of course if they had left for the weekend, he would have died in the freezer. And so they tell him this story to the guy. They says, we want you to know when he wakes up and everything, this non-Jewish guy saved your life. Somehow he knew that you were inside. And so they go to ask the non-Jewish guard. They said, how are you so sure? How did you know that there was someone still inside? And he says, I'll tell you something. I can't tell the difference between all you guys. You guys are all wearing black hats and white shirts and black jackets. I can't tell one of you from the next. But every single morning, everyone walks in and more or less just walks past me and doesn't really say anything. But there's one guy who always says, good morning, how are you? Something friendly in those regards. And then every afternoon, everyone walks past me again, and there's always one guy who says, good afternoon, have a nice evening, hope you have, and that happens every single day. This morning, everyone walked past me and someone said, good morning, and was very friendly. And then this afternoon, you all walked out and no one said, good afternoon, have a nice night. So I assume that guy must still be inside. So they tell this story to the guy in the hospital, and they say, your desire to say good morning to everyone and good evening to everyone saved your life. That's amazing. And he tells them that when he was younger, he was in Brooklyn, at 770. Actually, he wasn't at the Chabad house directly, but before he went on Shlichut, he wanted to go visit the Rebbe. And he wanted to be a shaliach, he wanted to be a rabbi, he wanted to try all these different things, but he never really had the ability to do the learning that was necessary. Whatever it was, he wasn't succeeding that, but he got an offer to be a shochet in South Africa. So before he went across the world, he wanted to get, sort of a bracha from the Rebbe, and he figured, I'm going to learn one thing from the Rebbe. I don't know what it's going to be, but I'm going to maybe learn how to pray a little bit better, or I'm going to learn how to learn a little bit better, whatever it is, I'm going to watch him for a little bit. So he spends, a weekend or so in 770 with the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and he watches everything he does, and he tries to daven with more kavana, but it doesn't really work. He tries to learn Torah with, greater passion. It doesn't really work. But one thing he noticed that the Rebbe always did was every time the Rebbe would walk into 770, there was a non-Jewish guard who stood outside, and the Rebbe would always greet him and stop for a moment and wish him well. And whenever he would leave, he'd always greet him again, wish him well, and then move on his way. No matter how many people he had with him, he'd always stop to recognize the guard. So he says, that's something I can do. So anyway, he tells the story, and of course, his words, just those few words, good morning, ended up saving his life. And what the Sefer Chinuch wants to remind us is, words are incredibly powerful. They can be very helpful in a time of mourning. They can be helpful when a person is struggling. They can be, very helpful when you're offering words of praise and how you offer praise. These are all things that can really change a person's life. There's a new study out about how parents give praise to their children, for example. And it suggests that if you give praise such as, you did such a great job, you're so smart, you're so wonderful, that actually could be detrimental to the children. Whereas if you say something like, you worked so hard on that, you gave it your best effort, can actually be very positive. And the way they demonstrated is, they gave kids tasks and puzzles, and they were pretty easy tasks. And afterwards they said, wow, you worked really, really hard, or they said, wow, you must be really, really bright. And then they gave them another puzzle that was much more harder, and in some cases was not even possible to do. And the kids who received the praise, you're so, so smart, gave up much earlier than those who were given the praise, you worked so hard. Because if you praise them on their effort, so they'll continue to engage in the effort. But if you praise them on something that's sort of intangible, it's who you are, then when they struggle with it, they realize, well, maybe I'm not so bright, and therefore they end up giving up. So words are very, very powerful, and the Sefer Chinuch wants us to emphasize our words and to understand our words in that regard. The Rabbeinu B'chaye, which I also brought at the very bottom of the page, offers a technical reason of why perhaps the lo yinakeh exists, that it will not be forgiven for this particular sin. If you look at the bottom source, the Rabbeinu B'chaye, he says, Rabim choshvim ki hanosei Hashem Yitbarach hashvua, right, in God's name. Many people think that the subject of raising God's name, leshav, it's not such a serious avera. Avera gedola. It's not a great big sin. And I will show them ki hu kasher mikol lavim. This is actually more heavy and strong than all the subsequent prohibitions that are going to come follow. Why? What about the rotzeach, the murderer, the one who commits adultery? He says these are indeed, very kashot averot, serious averot, but you don't do it all the time. If you're going to be a murderer, usually, we're not talking about a person who is a murderer by profession, but he says someone who is, the opportunity arises. You have a hatred with a certain person, you're not going to get caught, you're particularly angry at this moment. It happens, if it ever happens, and God forbid it should ever happen, once in your lifetime. The committing of the adultery also, he says, it's not just up to you. You need a partner. And so it's not going to always happen. It's a serious sin. But words, it's in your control all the time. And he goes on to say that you start using these words and you start realizing that they're ubiquitous, they're everywhere, and you can just talk and without consequences, and you begin to realize that maybe it's not such a serious sin at all, and you actually don't get any benefit from the sin. You just start lying in God's name and talking without any purpose, and there's no real great enjoyment in this even. It's just now who you are. It's a habit of how you behave. And he says, therefore, you won't even know that you've done something wrong, and therefore you won't even try to do tshuva on that. And that's why God will not forgive you, because you're not even aware that you're sinning. And he says that's the real problem with this. I, of course, want to look at a few other possibilities of what might be taking place in this regard. The Chafetz Chaim on this, by the way, points out that you perhaps have heard this before, we're each given, there's a source sheet up here if you'd like to, each person is given a limited number of words in their lifetime. And so therefore, it's about appreciating, and not wasting something that is limited. There's actually a movie with Eddie Murphy that has the same plot as this Chafetz Chaim of a person who has a tree in their backyard, and he has as many his life, he could continue to live so long as there's leaves on the tree. And every time he speaks, a leaf falls from the tree. And you see how, as he's getting fewer and fewer, he becomes more serious with his words, and they're more impactful and more powerful. Everything is very thought out and very careful. And that, by the way, is another important element that I think the mitzvah is trying to get us to do, is to think before we speak, to think before we act, to have real kavanah with whatever we do. If you look at the source number 4, where I started to talk about a little bit, the lo yinakeh, this midrash goes as follows. Lo tisa, right, the do not lift God's name for vain, and then you will not be cleansed. Kol hamivarech bracha she'eno tzricha. Now we're moving to the world of brachot in general, because there's a parallel between taking God's name in vain and a bracha where we also speak of God's name. Kol mivarech bracha she'eno tzricha. You make a bracha that you didn't need, or hitpalel tefillah b'lo kavanah, or you prayed without kavanah, which means you said God's name without kavanah, l'shav, or below zmanah, not in its right time because you weren't paying attention. Noseh shem shemayim levatala. You've raised God's name, or you've raised the name of heaven for wasteful purposes. And about this, the pasuk is written, Lo yinakeh Hashem. Hashem will not forgive that. Right? It's expanding the nature of this mitzvah. It's basically saying every time you mention God's name, you have to be very careful that God's name should be an impetus for us to have the proper kavanah to mean what we say, and to follow through with what we say. And it then goes on and says, and when you make a bracha or tefillah where you do praise God, then it's obviously a much more positive thing. And it says, obviously, if you're making a regular bracha, and it's a bad thing, so obviously it's a terrible thing if you then do it false, if you actually use God's name to lie. I mean, can you imagine if even just not doing it purposely, it's a problem, so all the more so when you're going to lie. But it's about having kavanah before everything we do, and saying what you really intend, and then saying something that you can, in fact, fulfill. That it has meaningless words. If you look back now in the English, on the Sefer Chinuch, on the left-hand side, he begins to explain to us what are we referring to. And when I first read through this, I'm not overly impressed, but I understand what he's now trying to get at based upon what we just read. You see it as follows. We should not swear in vain for no valid purpose, for it is stated, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Now this matter of in vain, purposelessness, is in four possible ways. For instance, if someone swears about something that is known, that it is not so, for example, about a marble pillar, that it is of gold, right? So you're saying something that's just not true. That's a problem. The second way, for example, if one swears about something that is known, that it is so, that's also a problem, right? The Gemara speaks about if you are walking in the way and you see a tree and you say, this tree is a tree. That's also a problematic statement because it's just unnecessary to make the obvious in that regard. This too is also in vain. About stone is stone or wood is wood, so anything similar. The third way, if someone swears to violate this precept or precepts, right? You say, I'm going to not fulfill this commandment, or I'm going to break this commandment. That's also a problem because you've already been adjured to keep the mitzvah. Now you're saying something that you're not permitted to do. And the fourth one is very similar, is to say something that you're going to do that's impossible to do. I'm going to not sleep for 3 days, or I'm going to sleep for 3 days. To say something that it's impossible to do is also saying God's name in vain. And what I take from that, and the Midrash we just read, is this problem of not being serious with our words, saying something that you just aren't going to do, that's not possible to do. This is actually an interesting machloket with regards to Sukkot. There's a machloket between the Ri and the Rabbeinu Tam about whether or not you should make a bracha before you go to sleep in the sukkah. The Ri says you should not make a bracha before you go to sleep in the sukkah, and the Rabbeinu Tam says you should make a bracha. Now, what's the essence of the machloket? So, some suggest that the Ri is saying you don't make a bracha because you can't guarantee that you're going to go to sleep. And what we've just learned here is whenever you use God's name, you better make sure that you're going to fulfill, whether it's in tefillah or bracha or an oath, you're going to fulfill what you've just said. And since you can't guarantee that you're going to fall asleep, you shouldn't make the bracha. The Rabbeinu Tam is not concerned. He says, what are you really making the bracha on? Not that you're going to definitely fall asleep, that you're going to try to fall asleep. You're making a bracha almost on the effort. And that's okay. And we have parallels of that. In Pesach, can you think of a parallel where the question comes up of what type of bracha you should make? When you search for the chametz, right? How many of you put out pieces that you're going to find? Right. You don't have to in principle, right? The real basics of the law is simply search. Make sure that there's no chametz. We did this crazy thing of putting out chametz when you already have no chametz in your house. You could almost say that that's counterintuitive to the mitzvah of getting rid of all your chametz. This has happened once in our time where we put out 10 pieces of chametz and we forgot where we put one of them, and we spent an extra hour looking everywhere for this chametz, and we got really terrified that there's going to be chametz in our house because we engaged in this custom. So the parallel is, well, are you making a bracha on succeeding, or are you making a bracha on the trying? So the bracha of searching for chametz doesn't guarantee that you're going to find anything, right? So that's okay. That's the bracha that you can make. The bracha of I am now going to find all of the chametz is a different idea, and that's parallel to whether or not you're going to fall asleep or not fall asleep in the sukkah. What's more important, the result or the effort? And you see this also in the bracha of hamapia, when you go to sleep at night. So how can you make the bracha that I'm going to go to sleep? There's no guarantee that you're going to go to sleep. So the reason why we're allowed to make the bracha is because what are we making the bracha really on? On the effort, right? I've shut the lights, I've gotten ready, I finished my work for the day, I'm not, looking at a screen. I'm ready to go to bed. If I don't fall asleep, that's okay because I'm making the effort. However, there's the Briskers, for example, they don't make this bracha because they think the real essence of the bracha is that you do fall asleep. And then once you've fallen asleep, you no longer can make the bracha anyway. So they say it's not a bracha that you actually make at nighttime because the concern is the result, not the effort. But it's an interesting machloket. But what underlies it, of course, is that we should really be careful anytime we bring God's name into the picture to fulfill what we say we're going to fulfill. In a sense, it's almost a chilul Hashem, because you're connecting your efforts to God, and if you then don't do it, so then it's as if God hasn't done it. And that's the continuation of the Sefer HaChinuch, that he connects everything that I've just said to God. At the root of this precept lies, right up until now we've spoken about the importance of words. The Sefer HaChinuch says, no, the real issue is that you're mentioning God's name. It's not words that are important, it's God that's important. And therefore it makes sense that it's one of the 10 commandments following the other of belief in God and not to have any other gods. At the root of this precept lies the aim that human beings should know and affirm in their minds and strengthen the faith in their hearts that there's no existence like that of God, right? It's very similar to the previous two mitzvot we've just seen. That he is in heaven above, living and enduring forever. So it is fitting and required of us when we mention his great name in connection with our actions and our words, that we should mention him in awe and fear, quivering and trembling. Not like the mockers who speak of light, trivial matters, things which exist, but fleetingly, or them that are lost to oblivion. We're talking about things that are permanent, that are important. We want to change the nature of our words and connecting it to God. It's really, we should do it in awe and the like. I want to go a little bit deeper into what the Sefer HaChinuch says, but before I do, I want to offer one other answer of why it perhaps is one of the 10 commandments. And that is to point out that when we take an oath in general with God's name, where is the most likely place that we will in fact make that oath?
In a courtroom.
In a courtroom, exactly. Right? We're brought in. It's a part of the judicial system. It's a part of keeping the integrity of the courts, elevated. If you think about in America some of the riots that have taken place over the last several years, very often they follow something that happened in court because the people didn't believe in the integrity of the system, that they felt that someone got off because there was either corruption or prejudice or something along those lines, and then there's these huge riots. And so anything that questions the integrity of the court system could be a very big problem for the well-running efficiency and efficacy and justice of the entire society. If you can't rely on your courts and your judges and the like, you have a big problem. And oaths are an essential element of the entire legal system in Judaism, in the courts, because when do oaths come into play? When you can't know the answer. When the answer to a question is above testimony, it's above facts, it's above evidence, and so therefore someone takes an oath that says this is what happened. So we really have to rely on that person telling the truth. Otherwise the entire system falls apart. I'll give you just one quick example, but there's hundreds of examples where the rabbis say, now is the time for an oath to come into play, and the oath is what solves the entire problem. In the Gemara in Gittin, for example, you have a case of a husband and wife who decide to get divorced. And the wife comes to get her ketubah, and the husband doesn't have enough money in the ketubah. Now, usually the way that was protected is that in order to get married in the first place, the husband had to have land, and the ketubah was connected to that land. Right? He had to actually put it aside. It was mortgaged for the purposes of paying the ketubah if ever the need arose to pay the ketubah. What happens if you have a poor guy who wants to get married and he has no land? So he has this ketubah. What does he do with it? He can't give, according to the rabbis in the Talmud, he can't give her a ketubah because that ketubah is worthless if it doesn't have money to back it up. It's as if he's giving him an empty piece of paper. So what many people would do is they would go to a friend, they would go to a guarantor and say, if in the unlikely event that we get divorced, and in the unlikely event that I don't have enough money to pay for the ketubah, will you guarantee this ketubah? So the wife could come to the guarantor, the Ariv, and get the money from him. And this happened, it's quite common, and usually you understand why the guarantor did it. He was probably a friend of the husband or a friend of the wife, and wants to help them out. It's a young couple getting married. And so sure, I'll sign off. In this instance, however, the guarantor is suspicious that the husband and wife are not really getting divorced. They're not really want to break up. The opposite. They actually want to stay together. They just don't have enough money. So what if they've concocted a scheme? They're going to get divorced. What's going to happen? The wife is going to come to the husband and say, give me my ketubah. He's going to say, I have no money. And then what's she going to do? She's going to go to the guarantor, collect the money for the ketubah, and then they're going to get remarried. By the way, lest you think this is a rare case, look through the newspapers, especially around the end of December in America, and you'll see many instances where these very wealthy people get divorced because they're trying to hide their assets. And so they get divorced, they put all their money in their wife's name, or their spouse's name. The IRS comes, it's the end of the year, they see that they don't have as much money, they levy a certain amount of taxes, and then at the beginning of the year, they get remarried, or they pretend to stay divorced, but they actually live together, and they basically are just hiding their assets. So it happens in every generation, in every society, people hide their assets one way or the other. That's what tax attorneys are trying to do for you. So in this instance, the husband and wife are creating a conspiracy, and the person who's getting hurt by this is the guarantor. So the guarantor comes to court and says, I don't think they're really getting divorced. I think they're doing it just to get money. Now, by law, he owes the money. He signed the guarantor. So what do you do in this instance? What would you do? So you have a couple of options. One option, if you're the rabbis in the Beit Din, you could say, well, we're not going to let them get divorced. That's it. We say we're suspicious of the divorce, so we refuse to allow the divorce to take place. What's the problem with that? What if they really do want to get divorced? It's not, it's like illegal to keep people, force people, right, to stay together who don't want to. What if it really is a genuine divorce? Judaism believes in freedom, and now all of a sudden there is no freedom. The other thing you could say is, well, you know what, guarantor, you don't owe anything. You could just walk away free. What's the problem with that? What happens if it really is a genuine divorce? Now this woman is without a ketubah, and she's damaged. So the rabbis come up with a solution of take an oath. Take an oath.
Oh.
The husband has to swear with God's name that it's a genuine divorce, and he will never benefit from his wife again, meaning he will not remarry her, he will not get any financial benefits, and he takes that oath, and then the woman can get the money from the guarantor. The guarantor at this point in time is satisfied, right, and it's taken care of, and the oaths were so serious that if the husband was a conspiracy, he wouldn't want to have the divorce if he didn't really want the divorce, so he wouldn't say the oath, and therefore then everyone's protected. In other words, the oath with God's name is what kept the entire system together. If that fell apart, if people took it not seriously, it's not simply saying something bad in God's name, it's destroying the basis of the entire judicial system. Every time we have a problem, someone would come forth and make an oath, and if you don't take it seriously, well, there goes your entire judicial system. That's why I think maybe when you think about the Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach, the 7 commandments given to all people, one of them is the laws of dinim, of establishing just systems. You don't see that in our 10 commandments, but maybe this particular law is related to that idea, the importance of having good court systems and fair systems with integrity. Let me return and just spend a few minutes. Let me say one more thing, and then we'll go back to the Sefer Chinuch. The real essence of this mitzvah, I think, for me, this is probably the most important reason why this mitzvah is here, but I'll just say it quickly, and then we'll go back to the Sefer Chinuch, is if you look at the Hebrew itself, right? If you look at the Hebrew, the English translation is not accurate. The Hebrew says, Shelo nishpa levatala, shene'amar, as it is said, Lo tisa et shem Hashem elokecha l'shav. The English is, you should not swear, do not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. If you had to translate the Hebrew, how might you translate it? Lo tisa shem Hashem elokecha l'shav. Never use God's name. Although interestingly, the word for use would really be tishtamesh. Lo tishtamesh. Never use God's name for vanity purposes. What's litisa? Right, it's raised. What is that language? Don't raise God's name in vain. So we always say raising must mean for naught, for swearing. But why? Where do they get swearing? Or even an oath? By the way, there is another mitzvah that talks about lo tishbaru. Don't take God's name, don't swear in God's name, l'shaker, for falsehood. Doesn't say oath, doesn't say nishba. It says lo tisa. Don't raise God's name. So what's the Hebrew really saying? So if you look at the very bottom of the source sheet on the right-hand side, this is from the Pesikta Rabtai. You see it, Lo Tisa L'Shav, number 5. It's a midrash on this verse. Amar Rebbe Bibi, by the way. So this is the source for the nickname Bibi from Binyamin, right? Amar Rebbe Bibi. In b'shvuat shav, if it's not false oath, help me out, what is it? How do we always translate a shvuat shav? How do we translate a vain oath?
Oath in vain.
An oath in vain. If it is an oath in vain, hakatuv medaber v'halo kvar nemar lo tishba'u b'shmei l'sheker. Wait a second, we already have if that's the issue, that it's an oath in vain, we already have a pasuk, which, by the way, the Sefer Chinuch also brings down as a mitzvah. I think he brings it down in 227. Mitzvah 227, I have it written here just to be sure. Anyway, he has it written down as another mitzvah. So then it should be there, under that pasuk, lo tishba'u b'shmei l'sheker. Don't swear in my name for false purposes. So the essence of this mitzvah is not about swearing, says Bibi, Rav Bibi. Ma Talmud Lomar, what are we to learn from this? Lo tisa et Shem Hashem Elokecha l'shav. Don't raise up God's name for vanity. Shlo tihei tefillin nosei. A person should not have tefillin on their head and their talis wrapped around them. V'holech v'over averot. And go out and do sins. What does he understand the real issue of lo tisa Shem Hashem Elokecha l'shav? He says the real issue has nothing to do with swearing at all, or taking an oath at all. Who is the person who lifts God's name? The person who lifts God's name, who raises God's name, and tisa is really like who raises it a banner, right? God's name is a religious individual, is an observant Jew. An observant Jew is someone who basically says, I'm on God's team, right? Look at me, whatever I do is symbolic and representative of God. And therefore, that's why a religious Jew has 2 obligations every time you get to a mitzvah, right? Every Jew has the obligation of not to speak Lashon Hara, and to eat kosher, and to keep Shabbat, and all these other things. To be fair with weights and measures. The observant Jew has an additional obligation. The reason why he is supposed to keep just weights and measures is because that's a mitzvah, keep just weights and measures. But also, if he doesn't keep just weights and measures, the person who he cheats says what? You're a religious Jew. It becomes a chilul Hashem. It's an additional prohibition that it comes to play at this point in time. This is therefore like a meta halacha. When I became observant, I was in college, and there were very few Jews on my campus. And I lived in the Jewish house, and there was a library. And basically, part of the way I became observant is I read every one of these books. And the books describe Judaism in this incredibly powerful, beautiful, ethical way. And I always say, thank goodness I read the books first before I met some observant Jews. Because if I went to a college campus where there were tons of observant Jews, listen, the way I think of it often is that there's no doubt about it that what I've seen in my experience, that observant Jews usually are more ethical, more sensitive, more chesed. You think about all the gemachim that exist. But there are also, to our great dismay, many people who claim to be observant, who keep kosher and look very Jewish, and then do something very, very unethical. And if I saw that, right, that might have crushed or it created a dilemma for me. I read a book that says Judaism is one thing, but then it's put in practice in a different way. And so there's this fear of Chilul Hashem, that you may turn someone away, because when a person does something wrong, they don't just say, they did something wrong. When the person is observant, they say, that observant Jew who represents God, and then they don't just dismiss that person, they also dismiss Judaism. And so therefore it has an incredibly negative effect on other people's relationship with God. And by the way, thank God it's the other way around as well. When an observant Jew does something, incredible, when we have the example of Feuerstein, I don't know if you remember, he owned a factory in Walden Mills in Massachusetts. And there's he's an individual who's an observant Jewish guy, and he owned a factory in Massachusetts. And there's a fire that burned everything down. And he was more or less at the age of retirement anyway, and the factory wasn't doing that spectacular, and he basically could have just taken the insurance money, closed it down, and retired to Florida. And what he decided to do is he paid every one of his workers, even though the fire, and he decided to rebuild, if I'm not mistaken. And he said the reason why he did so is because he could have done it by the laws of business and just taken the money and run, but his father taught him that that's not the appropriate way to behave, that you have to be yashar v'tov, you have to do the right thing. And he says that because of his faith in God is part of the reason why he did this. And all the workers, many of them who were not Jewish, most of them were not Jewish, praised not only him, but praised his religion as a result. By the way, as an aside, because it's a beautiful Dvar Torah, that I believe his father, who I believe his name is Mo Feuerstein, once taught that Rabbi Jonathan Sachs once heard him give. It's a great Dvar Torah. People often ask at the very end of benching, what do we say? When we get to the last paragraph, you say, Nara iti v'gam zakanti, I was young and now I'm old. V'lo ra'iti, and I haven't seen a righteous person want for food. So that's a difficult thing to say. You're telling me that anyone who's wanting for food can't be righteous, right? It seems to be problematic. It's Chabad, many people in the Chabad do not say that phrase because it seems inconsistent with reality. So this Mo Feuerstein says, you know how you're supposed to read that verse? So we're going to have Purim in just a little bit. V'lo ra'iti can be, and I've never seen, or the way it's in the Megillah, Esther, uses the same phrase, v'lo ra'iti. And it's not that, and I've never seen. It's I cannot stand to see. V'lo ra'iti, I refuse to see. And that's how it's understood in the Megillah. And Mo Feuerstein says that's how it should be understood in benching as well. V'lo ra'iti, I'm young and I'm old, whatever my age is, v'lo ra'iti, and I cannot possibly stand to see a righteous person who will be wanting or hungry for food, and therefore I will go and do something as a result to help them out. All this leads me to the last, perhaps, way of understanding this commandment. This concept of actually our words lead to actions, right? I began by saying that the way the Ten Commandments are structured is thought to speech to action. So when we say words, they're meant to lead to actions. What type of actions are we looking to create? So to sort of get an understanding of that and to maybe offer an additional explanation to the Sefer Chinuch, who talks about connecting our actions to God. What does that really mean, connecting our actions to God? I want to just go to the Chumash for a moment. What is the model of taking an oath in the Torah? And here I'm not talking halachically, but in the Jewish narrative, when we think of our stories, in Bereshit in particular, where do we have examples of people taking oaths?
Ruth.
Okay, Ruth takes an oath.
Yaakov.
Yaakov.
He comes back to Israel in his clothing.
Right, he takes an oath, right, to Hashem, that's correct. Other examples? Eliezer and Avram, that's what I'm actually thinking of, because that's one of the first ones, and it's actually parallel to another one with Yaakov as well, because what takes place in that oath? Avram says, he's not sure he can go to find a wife for his son. He turns to his servant. He says, I can't do it. I don't know how much longer I'm going to live even. Take an oath that you promise to do these things. And he says, where do you put your hand? On his thigh. Put your hand on the thigh. This, by the way, is repeated when Yaakov adjures Yosef. He says, I don't want to be buried here in Egypt. Make sure you take an oath. You swear that you will bring me up. He does the same thing. Yaakov, put your hand on my thigh. What's the significance of putting your hand on your thigh? So, in general, Rashi says, whenever you take an oath, you have to take something kodesh, something holy, with you to sort of infuse it with significance. Since Sinai, that means taking a Sefer Torah. Right? When you see in the courtroom dramas today, they always take out a Bible. And do you swear on the Bible? That's actually based on a Rashi, which is based on the Gemara, that says there's an obligation of nikitat, of holding on to something kodesh. That's the Gemara says. You always have to have something kodesh when you take the oath, so we know that you're serious about it. And most of the time, that's a Sefer Torah. That's how it was done in ancient times. Avram has a problem. This is before Sinai. So what mitzvah, what holiness does he have? So at this point in time, he doesn't really have a mitzvah. The only thing that he could really say is holy, right, is his Brit Milah. Right? That's the only mitzvah. His Brit Milah. Brit Milah, his circumcision. Right? That mitzvah he worked hard for. Right? And so that, Rashi tells us, is when it says, put your hand on my thigh, it's a euphemism for the Brit Milah, in that regard. So what does this mean? That to take an oath and do all these different things. So what I'd like to suggest is there are 3 steps in this oath, and these are the 3 steps that we're supposed to focus on when we take an oath in God's name. One of them is an expression of humility, our recognition that we're servants of God. Second is that we make a commitment. And the third is that our commitment and our actions have permanence, that they're not just temporary and going to disappear. Right? That's what the Sefer Chinuch says. The problem is, if it's something that's short-lived and it's going to disappear into oblivion, we're trying to make our words permanent. So the way I understand these 3 steps is as follows. The first one, as I mentioned, is humility. So there are other ways of making an oath or making an agreement even. In Ruth, you mentioned, it was taking off a shoe. Taking off a shoe is a form of taking an oath. In Mishlei, and I think Yechezkel as well, the form was actually a handshake. When you have an agreement with someone, you shake their hands. So the Rashbam and the Netziv both say, however, that those type of oaths are between equals. When you shake hands, you're both equals coming together. The oath of putting your hand on someone's thigh, that's something different. That's someone who is subservient to someone who's a master. That's Eliezer to Avram, or that's Yosef to his father Yaakov. It's a statement of, I'm here to serve you. We're not making a business arrangement, but rather I'm humble and I'm servant to you. And that's the first step in our oaths, that when we take God's name in our oath, it's really about us recognizing our position in this world, that we are servants of God. That God is above us, that we have to follow God's ways, that our words are dependent on God, that we need God to fulfill our words, and our words should be consistent and coordinated with God's will. That's the first step. The second idea, if you think about a Brit Milah is the statement of commitment, right? A Brit means a covenant, an agreement. And so it's a statement that I'm committing myself, not something that I'm a servant to God, but I'm committing to do something. That's what the Sefer Chinuch was speaking about earlier also, which is problematic. People saying things and then not following through. It becomes a form of Chilul Hashem, right? Because I'm using God to say it. I'm saying it in God, I'm not just, I don't have Twitter, but, it's an amazing thing, this thing, Twitter. You just say whatever you want to say, and it doesn't necessarily mean anything. It doesn't mean you're going to follow through. I see now in the news sometimes when they talk about the president's tweets. By the way, that's also an interesting thing. The way Chazal understand Lashon Hara is a bird chirping, and that's the symbolism of Twitter. So the argument that people have made sometimes when people have a problem with President Trump's tweets, one is they say, it's just a tweet, it doesn't mean anything, you don't have to follow it. So that's also problematic. If it doesn't mean anything, then why does it have to be said? And that's what the Chazal are telling us in this regard. When you say something, it has to mean something. There's an element of commitment. And then the third element of what our words should be recognition that we are servants of God. They should actually commit us and obligate us to do something meaningful, that we want our actions to have permanence in this world. And that's why we bring God into the picture. If we mention God, God is eternal, so hopefully our actions will have significance beyond our own lifetime and beyond just this one moment, right? If we believe words are meaningful, they're not just simply to leave our mouth and then disappear. They're supposed to leave our mouth and then have an impact subsequent to that. That's why, by the way, people often think about, the Sefer Chinuch says this as well, the Hebrew for swearing is in the passive, nishba. It's not an active thing. And he suggests, what does that mean? Well, nishba means that the person who is making the oath is transformed, right? It's reflective. It's transformed by the action. Our words should actually have an impact beyond just the words. They should change us who we are, change who we are. That's why it's in the passive. But more than that, not only change us in a permanent way, but go beyond us. That's why Rav Hirsch points out, for example, that what is really taking place when a person puts their hand on the thigh is they're saying, hold me up, especially in Yaakov's case. I'm about to die. I can't do what I want to accomplish without the next generation. So I'm calling upon you. I need your assistance in this matter. And that's what then Yosef was doing as well. And that's why the Brit Milah is also significant. Because what does Brit Milah also represent besides a covenant? It also represents the future, right? The Brit Milah took place on the sexual organ to say that we're talking about continuity, we're talking about, the future, the next generation. And so therefore that's also the model of an oath. The model of an oath is that it had to have this humility, it had to have this commitment, and it had to be thinking about the future, the next generation, and because that ultimately is what our words are meant to have the significance of permanence.
Yeah,
Yes.
in English also, a president is sworn in, it's passive.
Yeah.
Someone is under oath.
Yeah, because it's not an action that they're doing, it affects the person. The person becomes sworn. The person becomes under oath in those regards. So, in any event, I think, we're ready at 12:30. I think that will cover most of what I wanted to say. Let's see if there's one last thing. Nope, that will take us to the end of things. Have a good week.